Who here has heard the story of Samson? I have too, right? And everyone knows Samson. He's big and strong. He has a luscious hair. Obviously, I picked this story because I am not like Samson. But actually, I was teaching junior high ministry and a few weeks ago, and I was teaching the following week, and I was just talking to the kids, and hey, what do you guys want to learn? And somebody was like, let's learn about Samson. And so the Lord through that kid put it in my heart to learn more about Samson, and so I did, and there's a lot to Samson other than Samson and Delilah. And so that's what we're going to be covering tonight. So the life of Samson, or the first two chapters of the life of Samson. So we're going to be in Judges 13 and 14 this evening. So I grew up from a kid in church, going to Sunday school, and everybody remembers the story of Samson and Delilah. And Samson was strong and powerful, right? His hair got cut off, he got captured, but then ultimately he defeated the Philistines. But there's a lot more to that story. So let's start. So in Judges chapter 13, verse 1, it says, "And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years." So a little background, like that verse introduces us to kind of where we are. So let's catch you up, right? We didn't start at the beginning of Judges, so let's catch you up. So this takes place, surprisingly, during the Israelites' time of Judges. At that point in history, in Israel's history, right, they had already been taken out of captivity from Egypt by Moses. They had wandered in the desert for 40 years. They defeated the Canaanites and went into the land of promise by Joshua. And then they went into a continued cycle of behavior. And that cycle was Israel sinned and turned away from God. God then allowed some type of oppression to come in and put them under bondage of some sort. Israel would then cry out to God about how awful their situation was. And then God would raise up a judge or a deliverer who would bring them out of that, and peace would be restored for a time. So judges, we think modern day judges are, in our court system, but judges comes from the Hebrew word shofet, which means one who governs, rules, or delivers justice. So this was a leader, not a king. This wasn't the time of the king, so this was before Saul and the time of kings. But this was somebody in the Israelite community who God raised up to lead the people and deliver them out of their situation. And the theme throughout the book of Judges is that the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. And that was actually said in Judges 3:1. It starts off, again, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. And this phrase, to this point in Judges, has actually been said 6 times before. And each time there's been that pattern, right? Rebellion, oppression, deliverance, peace. So in chapter 13, we're told because Israel fell back into their sin, God delivered them into the hand of the Philistines. So who knows who the Philistines are? Anyone knows a little bit? So I'll give you a little bit of history. So Philistines were actually believed to come from the Aegean region of Europe, like think Greece, the Aegean Sea. So they weren't natively from the Mediterranean area, but they were from the north, the more European side. And so over time, they migrated down the Aegean Sea into the Mediterranean. And then they finally settled in what is currently like southwestern Israel or Gaza, like the Gaza Strip. That's basically where they settled. And the Philistines had 5 major city-states, and each city had its own ruler, but often they acted together as of one Philistine people when they were going against Israel. They were a very powerful people because they had the ability to work with iron. And so that allowed them to have iron weapons, which allowed them to defeat and oppress people very easily. And we'll actually see, we won't get to that tonight, but actually if you read in Judges 15 and 16, Samson finally gets captured because of iron shackles. So now because Israel turns away from God, God allowed them to be under Philistine rule for 40 years. And this is just the beginning. So let's continue. So Judges 13:2, and it says, "Now there was a certain man from Zorah of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children." So we're introduced to this man named Manoah. Manoah came from the family of Dan. Now, Dan was a tribe of Israel who was at this point in time settled in the southwestern part of Israel. So it made them very close to where the Philistines were. They were, for lack of a better word, like on the front lines of where the Philistines were compared to where the Israelites were. But Dan, the tribe of Dan wasn't considered a very strong tribe. In fact, earlier in Judges, the Amorites pushed them back into the hills, which prevented them from occupying the more desirable land of the plains. And it then continues to say Manoah's wife was barren, so she had no children. And so this isn't the first time in the Bible that God uses women who had never had children or shouldn't be capable of having children. And they're often used to bring forth people, special people, who are key parts of God's redemptive plan. So Judges 13, verse 3, and we'll go 3 to 5, it says, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, 'Indeed now you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Now therefore, please be careful not to drink wine or similar drink, and not eat anything unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb. And he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines.'" Okay. So, introduced to Manoah, we're introduced to his wife who has not had children. And now an angel of the Lord visits this woman. Who's heard this story before? There's quite a few of them, right? So many believe this angel was actually a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, or a Christophany. And while the Bible doesn't specifically say that, there's going to be parts throughout this message that I'll point out that give us some clues to support this idea. However, like I said earlier, God uses unlikely women to conceive and bear children who are miracles. So some examples are Sarah and Abraham, right? Sarah was old and barren. However, God sent a messenger announcing that she would have a son, Isaac. Another example is Isaac and Rebekah. She was unable to have any children, but then Isaac prayed to God, and she conceived and gave birth to Jacob. Zechariah and Elizabeth, an angel appeared to Zechariah announcing the child despite Elizabeth's barrenness, and she bore John the Baptist. And then there's, of course, Mary and Jesus. So here we have an angel decides to come to who? Manoah's wife, the woman. He didn't go to Manoah, he went to his wife. And he instructed her on what was going to happen and what she needed to do. I think it's interesting that the angel went to the wife. And we find this often, the angel goes to the wife. And there's a reason to this. You know, in life, I feel that women tend to be more receptive to the hearing of the Lord, to listen to that still small voice. Men, on the other hand, if we were approached by an angel, like we may put our guard up, right? We can tend to be thick-headed. We may take it as an offense or an attack. So the angel approaches the woman, not the man. So what does the angel tell her? That she's going to first conceive and bear a son. But then she gives her specific instructions. Do not drink wine. Do not eat anything unclean. For no razor shall come upon his head. And why did the angel say this? Well, Samson was to be set apart. So he was to be set apart from even before he was conceived. And Samson was to be a Nazirite. So the question is, what is a Nazirite? A Nazirite, first and foremost, let's say what it's not. A Nazirite's not a Nazarene. So a Nazarene is someone from the area of Nazareth. But a Nazirite was somebody who gave a vow. And the Nazirite vow meant, the Nazirite vow, the root word of it, meant to be separated or dedicated. And in the book of Numbers, chapter 6, it gives guidelines that a Nazirite would have to follow in order to take that vow. So there were 3 rules. No grapes or wine. So they couldn't drink wine or strong drink, and they couldn't eat anything from the grapevine. So no raisins, no grapes, no anything in between. And these people were to be set apart. They weren't to be influenced by drink or intoxication. And God just didn't forbid wine, but every similar drink. And even then, grape juice was off the table. Like, there was to be no temptation towards intoxication. So no cutting of hair, that was another one. So this was a very physical and visible sign and symbol of their dedication to God. Long hair, I've been told, I don't have it, long hair tends to be hot. I think a lot of ladies can say, I've heard it from my wife before, like in the summertime, it's just, they put it up and gets it off their neck. But a Nazirite couldn't cut their hair. So they would be burdened with this long hair for as long as their vow lasted. And they were also not allowed to touch a dead body, specifically human body. That's in Numbers what it talks about. And this rule, this commitment was so deep that they actually say don't allow even if it's a close family member. So if your father, your mother, your sister, your brother passes away, you can't touch them. You can't even be close to them. And they even actually had the circumstances, well, what if I'm just standing there and the person next to me drops dead? Like, that's in Numbers. It actually says, well, what do you have to do? They have to shave their head and they have to cleanse themselves. They have to cleanse themselves. And then basically their Nazirite vow restarts from scratch. And the reason for this, again, is to be holy and set apart. Death was dirty. Death is a curse. So they were not to be around it. And the final question is, well, who can take this vow? The reality is anyone, a man or a woman, could take the Nazirite vow. But it typically was voluntary, and it was for a time. It was temporary. Very few people, there's maybe 2 people in the Bible, Samson being one of them, who actually was a Nazirite from birth. The other was, I believe, Samuel. So Samson was chosen to be a Nazirite, but it wasn't his choice. God chose him to be a Nazirite. And it was the angel of the Lord who made this happen, who arranged for this. So let's continue. So in verse 6, it says, so the woman came and told her husband, saying, a man of God came to me, and his countenance was like the countenance of the angel of God, very awesome. But I did not ask where he was from, and he did not tell me his name. And he said to me, behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. Now drink no wine or similar drink, nor eat anything unclean, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb to the day of his death. Then Manoah prayed to the Lord and said, oh, my Lord, please let the man of God whom you sent come to us again and teach us what we shall do for the child who will be born. So Manoah's wife comes to Manoah and tells him all about what she just experienced, what had just happened to her. She tells him that this man of God came to her and that she didn't get his name, but that he was like an angel of God. I love how she uses the word very awesome, like beyond describable. And what does Manoah do? He does something very good, I feel. He listens to his wife. He's not like, what are you talking about? Like, that's crazy. You can't have kids. Like, who's this angel? What was his name? You don't know? No, he listens to his wife and he doesn't dismiss her. I feel that tells us that Manoah and his wife had a good relationship. It was a two-way relationship with good communication. There was trust. And when his wife came to him with this wild story, he doesn't dismiss her. He prays to the Lord, asking for the messenger to come again so that he can be taught about what to do with their new child, their promised child. And how does God respond? It says, "And God listened to the voice of Manoah, and the angel of God came to the woman again as she was sitting in the field. But Manoah, her husband, wasn't with her." I think it's kind of funny. God said, hey, send him again. God sends him again to the wife. However, this time it says, "Then the woman ran in haste and told her husband and said to him, 'Look, the man who came to me the other day has now just appeared to me.'" And so what did Manoah do? In verse 11, it says, Manoah arose and followed his wife. And I love that. We often see in modern day, like the wife needs to follow the husband, right? The man's the head of the household, and the wife should follow him. But here, it's the man who needs to follow his wife. And men, I would encourage you to always listen to your wives. They're our helper. They're our helpmate. Sometimes you need to listen to them and do what they're saying, because they, again, have this they're more attuned to some of these spiritual things than we are. So it continues. When he came to the man, he said to him, so Manoah said to him, "Are you the man who spoke to this woman?" And he said, "I am." Interesting word. He said, "I am." What did God say? "I am." In Judges 13:12, it says, Then Manoah said, now let your words come to pass. What will the boy's rule of life? What will be of the boy's rule of life and his work?" So Manoah sought from the Lord. He sought from this person. He didn't necessarily know who he was at this point, but he was wanting to know, what is God's plan for his yet-to-be-born son? So the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, "Of all that I've said to the woman, let her be careful. She may not eat anything that comes from the vine, nor may she drink nor may she drink wine or similar drink, nor eat anything unclean. All that I commanded her, let her observe." So Manoah asked how to raise his son. And the answer isn't necessarily pointed at the child. The answer is pointed at the parents. Let her be careful. As parents, I feel we often get pointed to Proverbs 22, verse 6. It's the verse that says, "Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it." However, the angel here is saying that part of that training begins with the parents' actions, being an example of what it means to be a believer in Christ. If Manoah's wife chose not to follow God's instructions, there'd be direct consequences for her child. If she had eaten grapes or drank wine or had unclean food, Samson's story would have been different. He wouldn't have been able to be a child who was set apart from birth. Likewise, if the example that we give to our children is that we live our lives as Christians of compromise, or that we go to church on Sunday, but then we go to the bar on Wednesday. Or how it was put, I can watch this adult rated R movie, but you're too young. What does that say to our kids? It teaches, we have a direct way of teaching our children what it means to be a believer in Christ. And if we compromise, we're teaching them that compromise is okay. So then we have an invite. So we move to verse 15. It says, Then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, Please let us detain you, for we will prepare a young goat. So Manoah just hears this great news. He's going to have a son. And he's like, well, how can I thank him? Let's celebrate. I'm going to go get a goat. You stay here. We're going to celebrate. We're going to have a barbecue. But the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, Though you detain me, I will not eat your food. But if you offer a burnt offering, you must offer it to the Lord. For Manoah did not know he was an angel of the Lord. So here the angel has no use for food. However, if Manoah wants to offer it as an offering, he had to do it to the Lord. He still didn't realize who he was talking to. He wasn't talking to a man, but to a messenger. So verse 17 then says, Then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, What is your name? That when your words come to pass, that we may honor you. So we're back to that name. And the angel of the Lord, how does he respond? He says, Why do you ask my name, seeing that it is wonderful? A quick note, that word wonderful, Isaiah 9:6 says, And his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. So verse 19 says, So Manoah took the young goat, and with the grain offering, and offered it upon the rock to the Lord. And he did a wondrous thing while Manoah and his wife looked on. It happened as the flame went up toward heaven from the altar, the angel of the Lord ascended on the flame on the altar. When Manoah and his wife saw this, they fell on their faces. When the angel of the Lord appeared no more to Manoah and his wife, only then Manoah knew that he was an angel of the Lord. So finally, Manoah gives an offering, a burnt offering and a grain offering to the Lord. And the fire, he lights it on fire, and the flames are going up to heaven. And the angel ascends into the flames and disappears. And when this happens, Manoah and his wife fall to the ground with their faces, for they just experienced something that many people haven't seen. They saw this ascension of this heavenly being. And we continue. And Manoah said to his wife, We shall surely die because we have seen God. He's like, I just saw God, guys. It's over for me. But what did his wife say? It says, But his wife said to him, If the Lord had desired to kill us, would he not have accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering from our hands? Nor would he have shown us all of these things, nor would he have told us such things as these at this time. So Manoah starts to panic. Manoah thinks he's a goner. But again, his wife reels him in, is an anchor into his life, and says, Hey, why would he tell us these things? Why would he show up and tell us these things if he was just going to kill us? Like, how does that work? And again, I think this talks about relationship, right? A husband and a wife, they're anchors to each other. And I love it. Proverbs 18:22 says, He who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. And for those of you who are married, that is true, always. It's not always easy to see sometimes, is it? But it is true. So continuing, so Judges 13:24, almost to the end of the chapter, it says, So the woman bore a son and called his name Samson. And the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. So finally, Samson's finally born. And his name was called Samson, which actually, his name means like the sun. And from the beginning, he was a Nazirite. And from the beginning, he received the Lord's blessing. And to finish the chapter, it says, "And the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him at the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol." And here we're going to be introduced. We're introduced to the first time this phrase, "And the Spirit of the Lord moved upon him." And we're going to see this phrase as we continue going through chapter 14 and then some future point 15 and 16, how it's the Spirit of the Lord moving upon Samson. The secret to Samson's power. It wasn't Samson himself who had the power, but it was God's power through his Spirit. So let's move to chapter 14. So some time has gone by now. Samson is no longer a child, but he's a grown man or a young man. In verse 1, it says, "Now Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines." So in the previous chapter, we were preparing for the coming of Samson. And in this chapter, we're presented with Samson. And the first thing we learn about adult Samson is, what does he do? He goes down to Timnah. Now, Timnah was not a city of the Israelites. Timnah was a Philistine city. And what's a little ironic is that it said that Samson went down to Timnah. One of the commentaries I heard said that was the beginning of Samson going down, is when he went down to Timnah. He didn't have a reason to go to Timnah. They were not his people. They were his oppressors. However, Samson and his desires went into the pagan city, and he saw a woman, a daughter of the Philistines. So studying this, my wife actually asked me the question, well, was it wrong of him to do that? The verse that first, comes to my mind is 2 Corinthians 6:14. It says, "Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And what communion has light with darkness?" Now that's obviously a New Testament verse, but what did it say in the Old Testament? In Deuteronomy 7, verse 3 through 4, it was speaking of the nations to be cast out by the Israelites. So like the Amorites, the Canaanites, etc. And it says, "Nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughter to their son, nor take their daughter for your son. For they will turn your sons away from me to serve other gods. So the anger of the Lord will be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly." And so what really stuck out to me was that phrase in verse 4. "For they will turn your sons away from me, from following me." Now, it didn't specifically apply to the Philistines, right? This was earlier, before the Philistines were around. But the main concern was about spiritual influence and idolatry. Philistines, like the other nations that were mentioned, they didn't believe in the true God, but they believed in pagan gods. And so the Philistines believed in the pagan gods such as Dagon. And so from a spiritual standpoint, just like today, it's spiritually dangerous to marry a non-believer. So verse 2 says, "So he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife." That's pretty blunt. He knew who he was pursuing, or he knew who he wanted. And he even says there, she's a daughter of the Philistines. So what? Again, remember this whole time, Samson is a Nazirite. He's taken a vow to be set apart. And what does he say? Go get her for me as a wife. Just goes to his parents. But then his father and his mother said to him, "Is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren or among all my people that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?" And what does Samson say? It says, "And Samson said to his father, 'Go get her for me, for she pleases me well.'" So the parents knew better. The parents were devoted Israelites. They believed in God's command. They would have known not to intermingle with their oppressors, with the Philistines. And they say to him, "Hey, isn't there somebody in our tribe that you like?" Samson's like, "Nope, I don't care. I want that one." He knew what the word would have said, right? Again, he was set apart. And then how he treats his father, he says, "Get her for me, for she pleases me well." His parents wanted what's best for him his whole life. They followed the instructions from the angel of the Lord from before he was born. However, Samson's now his own person. Their influence has diminished. And likewise, for any parents out there, our influence over our children changes over time. I have teenagers now. Some of them listen to me still. Depends on the night. Let's see if she's paying attention. Anyway. But what I would like to say, they didn't do anything wrong, but they also can't control what Samson does. The parents will always be parents, regardless of if their children are 5 months, 5 years, or 50 years old. But eventually, children become less fearful of their parents. And the fear I'm talking is the fear of respect and loving awe that drives obedience. But what does God's fifth commandment say? In Exodus 20:12, right? "Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land of the Lord your God is giving you." Now, children, which we all are, I would venture to say, that doesn't have an expiration date, does it? It doesn't say, "Honor your father and mother until you turn 21, or until you have your own family, or until you want to." No, it says, "Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land of the Lord your God is giving you." And so we're perpetually commanded to honor our parents. And with all that said, Samson's response to his parents was not honoring them. He didn't even consider their question. He just said, "Get her for me, for she pleases me well." This is where it changes a little bit. So in Judges 14:4, it says, "But his father and mother did not know it was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines, for at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel." And we're finally given a glimpse into why Samson was rebellious. God was looking for ways to turn against the people who were oppressing his people. And while God didn't condone or want Samson to stray, he allowed it to happen. And through that, God's plan was set in motion. Genesis 50:20 says, with Joseph speaking to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. But God," I always love that phrase, "but God." God can, has, and will continue to use broken, rebellious people in compromising situations to fulfill his divine and perfect plan. So Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother and came to the vineyards of Timnah. Now, to his surprise, a young lion came roaring against him, and the Spirit of the Lord, here's that phrase, the Spirit of the Lord came mighty upon him, and he tore the lion apart as one would have torn apart a young goat, though he had nothing in his hand. He did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. So here's the first example of Samson's strength. He's headed down to Timnah with his parents. They're going to set up the arrangements for the wedding feast to get this Philistine girl. So his parents are ahead, and Samson along the way finds himself where? At a vineyard. Again, Nazirite vow. He didn't have any reason to be in a vineyard. And who was there? A young lion. A young lion. Isn't that interesting? What in the Bible is also described as a young lion? Satan. In 1 Peter 5:8 it says, be sober. Again, Nazarite reference. Be sober. Be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So, this lion doesn't devour Samson. Samson tears this lion apart with his bare hands. And I was going to make a bear, like, you have bare hands? Anyway, sorry. It's in bare hands joke. But I would venture to say that Samson was probably surprised. Now, we're not given any examples of Samson's strength before this, but can you imagine a young lion, a young, powerful beast that's 400 or 500 pounds coming at you, and Samson, with his hands, kills it, tears it apart, like a goat, a young goat would be torn apart as it was being torn to pieces to be cooked. This strength wasn't his own. It was the strength that came from the Holy Spirit. And so we always see visions, pictures of Samson, in the Sunday school books of, kind of the trapezoid guy with the big, strong arms, right, and the long, luscious locks. He probably had long, luscious locks, but I would venture to say he didn't have big, strong arms. And why do I say that? Well, later in Judges, it said, and the lords of the Philistines came up to her, speaking of Delilah, and he said to her, entice him and find out where his great strength lies. Isn't that interesting? It wasn't apparent where his strength came from. And I would say if he was this big, strong bodybuilder kind of man, like they would know, well, the strength comes from his muscles. But if they're saying, like, figure out where his strength's coming from, they were as perplexed as Samson probably was initially. But after killing this lion, he continues on to Timnah. And in verse 7 it says, then he went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. Again, Samson was pleased by this Philistine woman. He wasn't desiring the Lord, he was desiring his plans. And he wasn't going to let anything come in the way of what he wanted, lion or not. So after that, he went back up to his home and waited for the wedding plans to begin. And in verse 8, it then continues, after some time, when he returned to get her, he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, a swarm of bees and honey were in that carcass of the lion. And he took some of it in his hands and went along eating. And when he came to his father and mother, he gave some of it to them, and they also ate. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of a lion. Now, I'm not sure why Samson had this morbid curiosity. Maybe he thought it was a fever dream and just wanted to see if, in fact, this lion was dead. But he finds this lion, and it had been there for some time. Like, these plans take time. It was at least weeks, if not months, in this hot sun, this carcass decaying. And it would have been rotten or even dried at this point. Now again, remember, Samson's a Nazarite. He's supposed to stay away from dead bodies. And so he inspects it, and then he sees a swarm of bees, and under the bees is honey. And I don't know about you, but if I found a carcass with bees in it and honey, I probably wouldn't have eaten it. I should say I wouldn't have eaten it. Probably is too much vaguity there. But Samson, for some reason, scoops the honey out with his hands. Again, he's now touching this dead animal, scooping it out, eating this honey. The honey itself, it was clean. Honey is not a forbidden thing, but honey out of a dead animal is not clean, even in today. If you come across honey in a dead animal, don't eat it. And again, he's going down to the wedding feast. He's on his way to meet his bride. And that's where it gets really interesting. So by ceremonial law, Samson has now defiled himself, whether he was a Nazirite or not. He ate some dirty things. He's touched a dead body. And the traditional method of cleansing themselves would have been to wash their clothes and wait till nighttime. And then at nighttime, for a standard person, a standard Israelite, they would have been cleaned. But for a Nazirite, it was different. Remember, they're set apart. So if they became unclean by coming across a dead body, they had to do things in order. The first thing they had to do, shave their head. 7 days. Then they had to offer a specific sacrifice, which was 2 turtle doves. They had to shave their head again, and only then would they be considered clean. But there's a caveat. All of their previous days in their vow were voided. They had to start over. So if an individual vowed to be a Nazirite for 6 months and they came across on the 5th month and 30th day and came across a dead body and they touched it, they would have had to go clean themselves for 7 days. On the 8th day, they'd come back, they'd be clean, but then they'd have to go through another 6-month vow. But then also, what does Samson do? He gives the honey to his parents, but he didn't tell them where it was. And that indicates that Samson knew what he did. He knew that he had just contaminated his parents. He just made himself, them unknowing, he's made himself and them unclean before going to a wedding feast. And he didn't tell them. He didn't want to pass the ritual impurity to his parents, or he didn't even want to face the consequences of his broken vow. All right, I'll try and move it along now. I apologize. So moving on to verse 10, it says, "So his father went down to the woman, and Samson gave a feast there, for young men used to do. And it happened there that when he saw him, they brought 30 companions with him. Then Samson said to them, 'Let me pose a riddle for you. If you can correctly solve and explain to me within 7 days of the feast, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you cannot explain it to me, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes.' And so they said to him, 'Sure, pose your riddle that we may hear it.' So the wedding feast starts. And as tradition for the Philistines, they brought in 30 groomsmen. Now these were Philistines. These were not Samson's people. Samson didn't like it. Samson just had to do these things because he was now not at a wedding of the Israelites. He was at a wedding of the Philistines. So he had to follow their traditions. And their traditions were, you get to give a gift to your companions. The companions like this. They're like, yeah, sure, I'll be a companion and I'll get, a pair of clothes or a cloak or whatever it may be. Samson didn't want that. Samson didn't like the Philistines, except for the women. He liked the women Philistines, but not the men Philistines. So he said, here, I'm going to give you a riddle. If you solve the riddle, I'll give you clothes. If you don't solve the riddle, you give me clothes. And they're like, sure. So here's the riddle. He said to them, out of the water came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. I don't like riddles. And I even know this is a bad riddle. Who would be able to guess that? Well, I'll continue. Now 3 days went, and they could not explain the riddle. But it came to pass on the 7th day, they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband, that he may explain the riddle to us, or else we will burn your and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us in order to take what is ours? Is that not so? So Samson thinks he's super smart. He's like, I'm going to tell him the riddle. Nobody will be able to guess it. I'm going to stack the cards. The groomsmen become upset, and who do they threaten? They don't threaten Samson. They threatened the Philistine wife. They threatened this girl and said, I'm going to burn you and your father's house. You better get me the answer because I don't want to pay. So what does Samson's wife do? She's at a precipice. Do I betray my new husband or do I potentially lose my life? And so Samson's wife then wept on him and said, you only hate me. You do not love me. You have posed a riddle to the sons of my people, but you have not explained it to me. And then he said to her, look, I have not explained it to my father or mother, so should I explain it to you? And then she wept on him the 7 days while their feast lasted. And it happened on the seventh day, he told her because she pressed him so much. Then she explained the riddle to the sons of her people, and so the men of the city said to him on the seventh day before the sun went down, what is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? And he, Samson, said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. So Samson's wife, she takes aside. She says it's better to betray your husband and keep your life than it is to keep your vows and risk it. And let this be a warning. The ends don't justify the means. Doing one sinful or evil thing in exchange for something good or right is still wrong. God will never put us in a situation where we don't have a choice but to sin. He will always provide a way out. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And our God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way so that you can endure it. So here, Samson knows his wife betrayed him. The groomsmen finally answer on the seventh day before the buzzer rings, gives the answer. And his response? If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. Not only is he upset with these men, he calls his new wife a heifer. Not very good for a newlywed couple. So then, to finish off the chapter, it says in verse 19, it says, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily. And again, here it is. And he went down to Achion and killed 30 of their men, took their apparel, gave the changes of clothing to those who had explained the riddle. So his anger was aroused, and he went back to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best friend. So Samson, despite turning away from God, turning away from his vow, betraying everything that he had done up to that point, still received the power through the Holy Spirit. And he goes to a different Philistine city because he doesn't want to pay. He decides to kill 30 Philistine men, and he gives those dead men's clothes to his groomsmen and says, here. Probably not a good gift. And then in anger, he goes back to his home in Dan. And what happens to his wife? Well, she's given to his best man. And there's consequences for that, but this is just the beginning. We still have chapter 15 and 16 through to go, so we won't do that tonight. So what are some takeaways? Spiritual drift. Doing things in our sight that is right, that is in God's sight that is wrong. Samson geographically went down to Timnah, and at that point, his spiritual life began a downward trajectory because he prioritized his own desires over God's plan. The cost of compromise. Samson's repeated compromise and entering the vineyard, touching the dead carcass, has slowly eroded the integrity of his vow. But it also shows God's sovereign grace. Despite Samson's brokenness, his bad decisions, his rebellion, God remained faithful to his promise to strike the Philistines. And it also, again, reveals Samson's true source of strength. And we must remember that true spiritual victory is not through our own effort, not through our own strong will, but it's through the Spirit of the Lord who moves upon